It started like any ordinary morning: grey skies, wet pavements, and the quiet hum of suburbia. But for Minister Enquirer, known on the streets of Birmingham as Big Z, November 5th, 2023 would be his final day. By mid-morning, the 21-year-old father lay dying on a residential street, the victim of a savage knife attack carried out not by rivals or strangers, but by a brother and sister he once considered acquaintances. Maya and Isaiah Marsh didn't have criminal records. They weren't feared names on the block, but that morning they armed themselves, tracked Big Z down, and took part in a brutal public execution over a £200 cannabis debt. Big Z had been trying to leave that world behind, scheduled for a driving theory test and a job interview later that day. He had dreams, and he had plans. But none of that mattered when violence came calling. What unfolded on Medway Grove wasn't a drug deal gone wrong. It was a calculated ambush born out of anger, trauma, and a warped sense of retaliation. And by the time the CCTV was reviewed and the knives recovered, the story behind the headlines had become one of the city's most tragic reminders of how quickly lives can be lost. To some, he was Big Z, a young drug dealer known for moving cannabis around Birmingham's Kings Norton estate. But to those who knew him best, he was Minister Enquirer, a 21-year-old father, son, and brother trying to claw his way out of the life that had gripped him since his teens. Big Z's route into crime was, sadly, typical of many young men in his community. The streets offered fast money, and cannabis became a means of survival. He cycled between neighborhoods, often carrying a knife, not out of malice, but as protection in a world where being unarmed could be a death sentence. Yet, beneath the street persona was a man growing tired of the chaos. Friends and family say Minister had recently begun to talk seriously about change. That very morning, the 5th of November, he was booked to sit his driving theory test, a small but concrete step toward a legal future. He had secured an interview for a legitimate job later that day. For the first time in years, there was momentum behind his efforts to leave the street life behind. He wasn't naive. Minister knew redemption wouldn't come easy. He'd made mistakes, and he wasn't pretending to be a saint. But he was trying. And those closest to him believed he was genuine. On that morning, when he left home, he wasn't preparing for violence. He was preparing for progress. His plan was to make a quick stop to a regular customer, then head off to his test. It was a routine moment in an otherwise hopeful day. But for all his intentions, Minister couldn't escape the gravitational pull of the streets. The world he was trying to leave behind caught up with him in the form of a debt-fueled rage, wielded by two people who never should have had that kind of power. Minister Enquirer died not in a trap house or in a gang feud, but on the cusp of change, trying to move forward, only to be dragged violently back. Maya and Isaiah Marsh weren't raised for violence, but life didn't give them many other tools. The siblings grew up in a volatile Birmingham household, marred by routine abuse at the hands of their father. Both were taken into care as children, bounced between foster placements that provided shelter, but not healing. What developed in place of stability was trauma, a kind that lingered into adulthood. By 2023, Maya Marsh was 23, employed at Lloyd's Bank, and presenting, at least outwardly, a picture of order. But beneath that routine was a different story. Maya battled mental illness and substance use, chiefly cannabis, which she regularly bought from Minister Enquirer. On the day of the killing, she had been signed off work for mental health reasons. Instead of resting, she armed herself and called her brother. Isaiah, just 20, was described as quiet, reserved, and deeply troubled. He had no criminal record, no known affiliations, and no history of violence. But he carried heavy psychological wounds. Reports would later confirm that he suffered from complex post-traumatic stress disorder, shaped by years of neglect and fear. He wasn't a gang member. He was a broken young man with no sense of coping, called into a confrontation that should never have been his to face. Despite the dysfunction, neither sibling had shown prior signs of criminal behavior. That morning, they didn't wake up planning to kill. But when Maya's calls for more cannabis went unanswered, and Minister refused to extend her further credit, rage and shame ignited something dangerous. It's easy to paint them as monsters, but the truth is more complicated. They were damaged individuals shaped by years of instability, trying and failing to live in a world they hadn't been properly prepared for. Maya's resentment over the £200 debt wasn't just about money. It was pride, it was frustration, it was entitlement disguised as desperation. Isaiah's compliance, arriving on a bike moments before the murder, was less about loyalty and more about the inability to think clearly under pressure. This wasn't a calculated hit, it was a catastrophic emotional collapse. But the result was the same. A man lay dead, and 2 more lives were destined to follow him into ruin. It began with a message, just £20 worth of cannabis. Maya Marsh owed £200 already and had a history of late payments. Still, she assumed Minister Enquirer would front her another bag, as he had in the past. But this time, he didn't. Minister was moving differently. That morning he had places to be, a driving theory test and a job interview. He wasn't in the mood to play dealer to a customer who didn't pay. Maybe he was drawing a line. Maybe for once he was choosing to be firm. And maybe that rejection was the spark that set the rest ablaze. Maya didn't take it well. She waited outside his Kings Norton flat, pacing and fuming. She called him multiple times. No answer. In her version of events, she felt disrespected, like she'd been treated with contempt. That wounded pride was enough to send her spiraling. At some point that morning, she armed herself with a kitchen knife. Then she called her brother. Isaiah had no part in the debt, no stake in the situation, but when Maya asked for backup, he answered. It was a tragic decision, one with irreversible consequences. Isaiah mounted his bicycle and began pedaling towards Medway Grove. On the way, he was on the phone with Maya. CCTV later captured her walking up and down the road, voice raised, eyes wild. By the time Minister arrived on his bike, the atmosphere was primed for violence. She stopped him in the street, demanding drugs. When he tried to leave, she grabbed his handlebars and spat venom at him. "You're not going nowhere, you prick," she shouted. And in that moment, the fight could have fizzled out. Minister didn't escalate. He didn't draw his own knife. He tried to disengage. But Isaiah arrived seconds later. He approached with false familiarity, wrapping his arms around Minister's shoulders in what looked like a greeting, but quickly turned physical. A scuffle began. They tumbled to the pavement. A knife dropped. Minister's own. The camera lost sight of the pair behind a substation. But what happened next wasn't caught in full. It didn't need to be. Witnesses, forensics, CCTV. It all told the same story. That call Maya made wasn't just a plea for help. It was a trigger. The attack that followed wasn't just violent. It was feral. At approximately 10:10 a.m., Minister Enquirer, Big Z, arrived at Medway Grove on his bicycle. It was supposed to be a quick stop before his driving theory test. Instead, it became the site of his murder. CCTV captured Maya Marsh already pacing the road, her movements agitated, her voice raised. As Minister approached, she stopped him, grabbed the handlebars of his bike, and screamed abuse. He didn't retaliate. He didn't threaten her. He simply tried to get away. But within seconds, her brother Isaiah arrived. He had been cycling over while on a live phone call with Maya. He saw the confrontation unfold, and instead of diffusing it, he escalated it. Isaiah dismounted, approached Minister from behind, and wrapped his arms around his shoulders, a gesture that pretended familiarity but was charged with menace. Minister, alert and strong, managed to throw Isaiah off. The 2 men fell to the ground behind a power substation, just out of CCTV view. In the scuffle, Minister's own knife fell onto the pavement. Maya saw it. She picked it up. And what followed was as deliberate as it was devastating. The 2 men emerged back into view, still grappling. Minister was trying to escape. Maya handed the fallen knife to her brother. Isaiah paused, just briefly, before plunging it into Minister's torso. Again and again. The stabs were wild, furious, uncontrolled. Minister tried to resist. He struggled and twisted. Maya didn't stand back. She joined in, pinning his arms as her brother continued the attack. Blood spilled into the road. The violence was close, frenzied, and sustained. In the midst of the carnage, Maya momentarily turned her head. Blood in her eyes, perhaps, or maybe the horror catching up to her. But she didn't stop. Eventually, Minister broke free. Wounded and stumbling, he fled down the road, leaving a trail of blood behind. He reached a nearby house and rang the doorbell. The homeowner's Ring camera recorded his final moments, barely able to speak, soaked in blood. He collapsed on the doorstep. 2 women rushed to help. Paramedics were called, but it was too late. Minister Enquirer died where he fell, on the street, alone, in daylight, stabbed to death in the middle of a Birmingham estate over a £20 debt. The city lost another son, and 3 families would never recover. In the moments after the killing, chaos gave way to cold calculation. Maya and Isaiah didn't call for help. They didn't wait for police. They fled. Back at their home, panic took hold, but so did a plan. Maya wrapped Isaiah's injured hand and helped clean the blood. The knife used in the attack, along with another taken from their kitchen, and their bloodied clothes were bundled into a bin outside. Then they vanished. Isaiah went to his father's house, then later to Heartland's hospital, where he claimed he'd fallen off a bike. Maya, disturbingly composed, went to work. Hours after helping kill a man in the street, she clocked in for her shift at Lloyd's Bank, as though nothing had happened. That night, she didn't return home, staying at a friend's house instead, no doubt anticipating the inevitable. But by the following day, the pressure was too much. The siblings turned themselves in. Initially, they lied. They claimed self-defense, claimed Minister had attacked them, claimed they didn't know what would happen. But their story unraveled fast. CCTV, phone records, forensic evidence, all told a different story. There was no ambush by Minister, no attack from him. The ambush had been theirs from the start. 2 knives, 1 shared plan, and a level of brutality that no defense could explain away. The Marsh siblings weren't hardened criminals, but in those minutes on Medway Grove, they became something else entirely. And now the law was ready to catch up. At Birmingham Crown Court, the trial of Maya and Isaiah Marsh unfolded over several harrowing days. The evidence was extensive. See CCTV footage, phone records, witness testimony, forensic data. The siblings' defense was simple. They claimed self-defense. They said Minister Enquirer had threatened them, that they were scared, that the stabbing was never the plan. But the jury didn't believe them. It took just under 4 hours of deliberation for the panel to return their verdict, guilty of murder for both. The courtroom remained hushed as the decision landed. Maya stood motionless. Isaiah stared at the floor. There were no outbursts, no tears, only silence, a stark contrast to the frenzied violence that had ended a young man's life just weeks earlier. Judge Simon Drew KC addressed the court with measured clarity. He acknowledged that Minister Enquirer, known on the streets as Big Z, had been a drug dealer. He had carried a knife. But, the judge said, that did not provide justification for what happened to him. He did not die instantly, Judge Drew noted. He tried to flee. He was in visible distress, in pain, and seeking help. His final moments were captured on a doorbell camera. They were not the final moments of someone who posed a threat. They were the final moments of a young man desperately trying to survive. The judge went on to address the ambiguity surrounding the murder weapon. It was unclear whether the fatal stab wounds came from the knife Minister dropped during the scuffle or the one Maya brought from her kitchen. That uncertainty, while not enough to acquit, did affect sentencing. Had it been clear that a weapon was carried with intent, both would have faced minimum terms of 25 years. Instead, Judge Drew set the minimum term at 20 years for each. Maya and Isaiah Marsh were sentenced to life in prison. They will be eligible for parole in their 40s, subject to the approval of the parole board. For Minister's family, the sentencing brought some sense of legal closure, but no peace. His mother, seated in court throughout, delivered a devastating victim impact statement. "My son wasn't perfect," she said, "but he was trying. He had a driving test that day, a job interview. He was making steps finally to change his life. And now he's gone. To live with that is unbearable." She continued, "This was a senseless act of violence. It beggars belief. He was trying to be better, but two people decided he didn't deserve that chance." Minister Enfrence's life was not defined by sainthood, but by a struggle for redemption that was tragically cut short. His murder at the hands of two equally broken individuals is yet another reminder of what's at stake when trauma, violence, and pride collide in the wrong moment. The justice system has spoken, but for three families and a grieving city, the pain endures.